All right. Once again, welcome back, everyone. Allow me to introduce Carol Gould, Carol S. Gould, who is professor at the Department of Philosophy at Florida Atlantic University, where she's also a distinguished teaching fellow in the Center for Future Mind in the FAU Brain Institute. Carol publishes widely in aesthetics, ancient Greek philosophy, philosophy of psychiatry, and more recently, Japanese philosophy. Her forthcoming book is Glamour, A Philosophy of Elusiveness, Bloomsbury. Congratulations, Carol. We look forward to that. And Carol received her PhD and BA from University of Buffalo, SUNY, studied at Brown, and is also a philosophical practitioner of many years standing, based in Boca Raton, Florida. And her talk today is titled Philosophical Counseling as a Tool for Addressing Body Dysmorphia. Welcome, Carol. The floor is yours.
I'll begin by just saying what led me to this topic. And I have a physician friend who had audited a couple of my lectures in philosophy of psychiatry. And he also knew of my work in aesthetics, philosophical aesthetics. And he gave me an article he found on the role of aesthetic sensibilities in body dysmorphic disorder, which I'll explain as throughout the paper. The authors of this paper offered powerful arguments for the hypothesis, in support of the hypothesis, that patients with body dysmorphia had more heightened aesthetic sensibilities than the general population. So without elaborating here, let us assume that at least many body dysmorphic patients, clients, are unusually sensitive aesthetically or have heightened aesthetic sensitivities. Now, body dysmorphia is a pathological loathing of one's own body or some part of it. Body dysmorphia was not officially classified as a separate disorder until 1987 in the revised DSM-3. And some have called it one of the most devastating maladaptive psychological disorders for a variety of reasons. Its victims feel profound self-consciousness about a perceived flaw or set of flaws. And it's notoriously underdiagnosed. Patients are reluctant to report their symptoms. Even patients who will admit to an array of other symptoms, they feel shame or discomfort admitting their body dysmorphia and about their bodies. This is exactly the case with a client of mine, as I discuss later in the paper. A highly maladaptive condition, it makes people live with self-disgust, avoid relationships, and often lacks in meeting their academic or professional obligations. Body dysmorphia sufferers may find it hard to live normally with others and may spend exorbitant sums on cosmetic surgeries or enhancements. And I'm not speaking here of the odd nip or tuck. Rather, they have, radical facelifts, rhinoplasties, biceps, and as we know, other implants, especially now, that's one of the most common procedures. And some people with normal genitalia have unnecessary and very sad reconstructive surgery. And I'm not speaking about people who have, sexual reassignment. I'm speaking of other things. That search for perfection everywhere. One of the most chilling is this, of all is the surgery some endure to add height, a surgery with a recovery time of a year or more, and in a wheelchair, no less. Some pull at their hair compulsively or pick at their skin. Many resort to procedures not only self-punishing, but well beyond their financial means. Some therapists take it to be a form of OCD and or delusional disorder. There are two subtypes of BDD, which I recently learned. One, muscle dysmorphia, found mainly in men, but not exclusively so, who feel their musculature and is inadequate, and or that they are too small bodily as human beings. The second subtype is body dysmorphia by proxy. And it's exemplified by those obsessed with what they perceive as a flaw in someone else, someone close to them, a child, parent, significant other, etc. So whatever its guise, therapists usually treat it primarily with cognitive behavioral therapy and or SSRIs. These, however, are mainly palliative. And this is where philosophical counseling can come in to accompany a clinician, a medical clinician, because it can help the patient attain what is now called philosophical health. And I'm thinking here in particular of Louis de Miranda's concept of it. Now, insight might not cure the obsessive problems and thoughts, but once found, it is not lost. And the newly experienced insight may gradually be more than just a temporary fix, unlike some of the other modes of treating it. And I shall argue here that philosophical counseling can provide a unique sort of help if the counselor aims at bringing a person to envision a life with a new meaning and to revise their narrative. And that would be one important idea enmeshed in philosophical health as de Miranda conceptualizes it, helping one refashion their, quote, sense of the possible. Time does not permit me here to rehearse his method. I will, however, discuss particular sorts of insights the practitioner may help the client achieve, specifically a strong sense first of the distinction between the ethical and the aesthetic. Second, the ethical injustice they inflict on themselves through self-objectification and diffidence. Three, how for some, this is a response to cultural pressures, not to all, but for some, a response to cultural pressures. And most importantly, four, what it is to have a truly acute sense of the aesthetic and its role in a person's self-worth. By acquiring self-knowledge and understanding of the culture in which they are embedded, the client could begin to reinterpret and write a healthier narrative for their future. The telos for a client with body dysmorphia disorder would be, as de Miranda would have it, a new idea of the possible and renewed sense of meaningfulness. And I love this notion of the new idea of the possible. The pertinence of his method, especially for body dysmorphic disorder, is that it, quote, proceeds from a primary dimension of embodiment and sense of self to a conceptual worldview. His ideals are akin to those of existential and person-centered therapists. And let us note from the start, and this relates back a bit to Kevin's paper, that a philosophical counselor should acknowledge the client's concerns rather than dismiss them as delusional or vain. However inauthentic or frivolous the practitioner may find the client's concern with physical perfection, as the client sees it, the counselor must create an empathic therapeutic environment in which a client can comfortably air their concerns without feeling judged, lest they not articulate or admit to them. And philosophers, I think, are especially well suited for this. We should recall the Rogerian idea that a counselor or therapist should meet the client, quote, where they are. that is, validate their phobias or worries, and with empathy. Some philosophers think, and I emphasize with empathy because some philosophers think that a preoccupation with appearances is morally suspect, perhaps an ethical vice of vanity, or a dangerously unsocratic hierarchy of values. After all, most of us admire Socrates for having excoriated the Athenians for caring more for their bodily beauty than for their characters. One cannot simply tell a client to adopt Socratic values, for we do live in our bodies and in a social world. And Socrates himself cared for his body. And we can see this in the Symposium, among other places. And we all know that he worked out at the gym every day and was a brave and a capable soldier in battle. Or some circles in contemporary culture might deem body dysmorphia a form of narcissistic preoccupation with one's appearance, while others may see that conformity as admirable, as people are encouraged to follow, for example, influencers who encourage bodily enhancements, some being, as we know, disfiguring. And I'm sure you've all seen pictures of such examples. Now, recall that Merleau-Ponty grounds his philosophical system on the principle that we live in our body. Each of us is an embodied consciousness that transforms as we interact with others. More recently, Richard Schusterman, too, has made sophisticated contributions to current philosophical ways of conceptualizing the body, which he points out have tended to be more disguised social and political critiques than conceptualizations. Hence his own theory of somaesthetics, which is quite complicated and I think has made an important contribution to, to philosophy in general, as well as aesthetics. If not consistent with the Socratic hierarchy of values, some concern with appearances certainly is part of an Aristotelian one, which arguably is preferable for reasons I can't get into now. But in the 1940s, the pragmatist American philosopher Kurt Ducasse wrote a now obscure article entitled The Art of Personal Beauty, which illuminates this and this Aristotelian bent. His argument is twofold, moral and pragmatic. He says that we have a moral obligation to be minimally presentable and inoffensive to others. He also points out, more pragmatically, that being attractive to others is of great moment to practically all of us. For better or worse, our, quote, personal happiness and prosperity, he tells us, quote, depend throughout life very considerably upon the attitude of the persons with whom we come in contact. Moreover, the contact with many of those who can affect our fortunes is brief and superficial. And the briefer and more superficial it is, the greater is the importance of the surface we exhibit, since it is then all they have to go by. You know, he's not, by the way, just as an aside, he's not speaking here of, being glamazon or the, kind of movie idol, or, I shouldn't say, leading man good looks, but he's just talking about being, minimally presentable, living within the culture. So the two ways he tells us that we can become attractive are either likableness or fascination. The former being likableness, that is, being more about reality, the other appearance. Likableness is about personality and character, where fascination is, quote, less closely connected to the real worth of its object, unquote. When he talks about fascination, he equivocates between two concepts, one being about biologically given beauty, the other about imaginative efforts at self-editing. But one need not be naturally beautiful or adept at self-editing to feel comfortable with oneself. Self-presentation, as Ducasse insinuates, includes vocal and gestural modes of expression. Interestingly, Ducasse, and this is a parenthetical remark, Ducasse is a strong believer in parapsychology and in spirits. So he recognized the human interior. Now, back to body dysmorphia. The sufferer of body dysmorphia is, in a sense, living in what Du Bois calls double consciousness. That is to say, being unable to escape seeing themselves through the eyes of others. So this would make it impossible. It would make impossible such improvisational and imaginative self-editing. Now, before elaborating on how de Miranda's sense-making method may allow a client to reach philosophical health, allow me to present a case of one of my clients with whom I've had at least partial success so far. Like Kevin, I had the experience of my client telling me that it has been more helpful than the psychotherapy that he tried. Now, my client, Matthew, is a man in his mid-30s, and he consulted with me to discuss what he thought was his key problem: troubled relationship with his girlfriend. He was attractive and well-educated, very well-educated, and starting a promising career. He had a deceptive air of confidence about the power dynamic in his relationship. As he revealed more, I learned that he had been sexually and emotionally abused by his father, a wealthy businessman, from whom he claimed to be estranged. As his story unfolded, I saw that he was still erotically enmeshed with this woman, even though they had not been sexually intimate for a few weeks, and both had agreed to redefine their relationship as just friends. Clearly, he still loved this woman, despite her, what he called her true craziness, as he felt that he had, quote, never met anyone like her. She was physically attractive, he said, and shared a similar worldview to his. And his worldview was an unusual one. Leave it at that. Given some of his preconceptions, like-minded women would be rare indeed. Not insignificantly, he was highly judgmental about and obsessed with the appearance of others, and had some rather questionable, contemptuous ethnic biases. His aesthetic sensibilities were active and attuned to both visual and literary elegance. Early on, he mentioned in passing that he had some body dysmorphia issues. Namely, he said, unlike his brother, he was, quote, not strong and naturally athletic, built to be naturally athletic, even though, he quickly added, he was the intelligent and academically successful of the two. His anxiety in discussing his feelings about his body were evident from the way he so quickly retreated from the issues whenever he happened to mention them, whenever they slipped out. Perhaps a case of classic Freudian avoidance. After earning an MA in a humanities field, however, he went on to train in a highly skilled, physically demanding, and lucrative profession. Even after developing his body to be, quote, ripped, as they say, he still saw himself as small and had concomitant trouble with sexual performance because of it. His problem was more specifically the subtype of body dysmorphia that they call muscle dysmorphia. And he was considering various ways of remedying it, one or two more unfortunate than the others. Although he had developed muscles by working out, and he carried himself naturally with almost elegantly, he carried himself very well. He could not come to terms with his natural bodily limitations. My aim was and remains ambitious, to lead him to what D. Miranda calls philosophical health, he conceived of in his conception. I realize he's not the only one who has this, who has a concept of philosophical health. I asked my client about his appreciation for language and his visual environment. Since his bodily shame seemed to gnaw at him so deeply, this seemed a promising starting point. Also, given D. Miranda's method, it seemed promising because the method begins with the client's sense of embodiment. Matthew valued art and culture and felt that he appreciated it more than most other people. Matthew has a nimble mind and broad education. So I asked him what he thought about Walter Benjamin's well-known notion of the aura. Benjamin argues that once artworks are mechanically reproduced, they lose their aesthetic value, for an original has an irreplaceable aura, unique to itself. The aura defies reproduction. Persons, being distinct individuals, are like artworks in that each is distinct. No matter how closely one copies, say, an influencer or a brother, one cannot achieve qualitative identity. At best, one might seem or come off as a kitsch reflection and someone trying too hard. Similarly, a guy more ungainly and unattractive, I pointed out, might try to imitate Matthew himself. Since Matthew's father had inflicted a deep psychic wound, I worked to help him see himself not as a perfect specimen of masculinity, which he aspired to be, but rather as unique and more than presentable. We spoke about the plausible Nietzschean idea of a person or person's life as a work of art. He agreed that a work of art that meets precisely conventional standards of a genre usually lacks interest, even if it is in some sense beautiful. And after all, I mean, most of the works of art we consider wonderful and are in the canon considered great works are not beautiful, far from beautiful. But they have considerable aesthetic value. Since antiquity, I reminded him, Persian rug makers would include a flaw in every rug they created. The distinct imperfection was necessary to its beauty and value. More importantly, the artist would not be tempting God with the hubris of striving for perfection. For Matthew to aspire for the perfect body he wanted, as he conceived it, would be analogous to a carpet maker trying to craft a perfect work, which would be a futile endeavor, as well as hubristic. One of Matthew's tasks was to accept his body and to see its distinctive value and to take pride in how he worked so hard to become sufficiently strong and agile to succeed at his physically demanding profession. While he has not yet reached this psychological telos of self-acceptance, seeing it as a goal was the initial step for him to take to reach it. Now, Aristotle, of course, begins the Nicomachean Ethics with this very point. If we are to aim at a target, we have to see where to aim and exactly what the target is. So to reach the good and attain eudaimonia, we must have an idea of it. I asked Matthew whether he believed the athletic masculine ideal was universally accepted or whether it even should be. He was not sure how he felt about that. And he gave himself the homework of trying to figure that out. And this was a very complicated idea, and I know fraught with many issues about ethnicity, sexuality, and disability, but Matthew was not ready to explore some of that and those attitudes so that were deeply implanted in him. Now, this takes me to the next idea I explored with Matthew, who is, like all of us, a work in progress. Like many with BDD, or body dysmorphic disorder, Matthew has been comparing his body or features of it to others for much of his life. In doing so, he has presupposed that others are worthy of admiration, and he is not. This is, although he would probably have denied this. But given this assumption, his life has been sabotaged in two ways. First of all, his assumption has instilled in him a defensive contempt for many other people, and it has interfered with his having a mature love relationship. I have brought up with him an ethical matter, ethical in the sense of character. A character primed to attain virtue, which for Aristotle is a mean between two poles, one a virtue, the other two, one in excess and the other deficiency. Now, Aristotle, so we have two kinds of vices and one virtue corresponding. Aristotle speaks not only of virtue per se, but also of individual virtues. Like the doctrine of the mean itself, the individual virtues each invite controversy. Perhaps none more so than his virtue of what's called magnanimity or great souledness, which Aristotle considers the crowning virtue, that it's inseparable from every other virtue. It involves respect or honor. To be a great-souled person is to have a proper sense of self-regard. The term self-esteem, which is roughly equivalent, sticks in my craw. But what he means is that one should know what one deserves and expect it from the world. One should know, and when he talks about what one deserves, in this case, having a great soul, he's talking about honor and respect from others. Now, his notion may seem elitist and culturally embedded, but it can be brought up to date. It's a mean between an unwarranted sense of entitlement and a self-disregarding diffidence. It is worse, according to Aristotle, to be unduly self-effacing, he considers it, or to be a nameless person, than to be conceited. Matthew initially thought he might be guilty of excess self-regard or arrogance. But then I asked him to consider his feelings about his body. To be great-souled, one must see oneself as deserving of the same honor or regard from those of good character and honors that are worth earning. You don't want to be, say, honored for being a good embezzler or murderer. He appears to be shifting, Matthew appears to be shifting his feelings, but this will require him to examine the other elements that bestow meaning to his life. The ethical point, though, he must internalize is that to honor others or respect others more than they deserve and to dishonor himself for something that they have not earned but were won by genetic lottery is to be unjust to himself, that is to say, in the distributive sense. Perhaps a Kantian would accuse him of violating the categorical imperative. But, Matthew's biological gifts, or gifts of fortune, we might say, were worthy of respect and certainly not worthy of disrespect. No one's, we might say, are. So he was, in a sense, applying one standard to himself and another to everyone else. The other elements in de Miranda's approach, as he discusses in a few places and in a soon-to-be published paper, include, to paraphrase, selfhood, belonging, new life narratives, that is the sense of the possible, purpose, and coherent philosophical vision that governs their life in the world and feelings as a self with agency. Matthew has an arduous path to achieving the self-knowledge and sense of purpose that is philosophical health. But he has started to look differently at his body and has left behind the relationship that was feeding and fattening his insecurities. To do so, however, that is to say, to look differently at his body, is to confront questions that previously terrified him. They're not only about his body, but about his entire self that his father urged him to identify with or as. So if all of this works out as hoped, Matthew will be giving himself what few manage to do or have the courage to do, namely choose the path leading to a newly gleaned destination, one in which he has a totally restructured sense of values. So let us hope.